Hi there, I'm Annemarie. I'm a genre fiction writer and editor, and welcome to my channel. Recently, I've been working on quite a few fantasy manuscripts, and I've noticed some similarities regarding world building that I thought would be fun to talk about, specifically where weaknesses in world building generally crop up. I thought today I would talk about kind of the 5 most common mistakes that fantasy writers make when it comes to world building. And these are most common in that you often see them with up and coming writers, new writers, writers who are doing their first full length book manuscript. So, yeah, I thought that would be a fun topic. I love world building. It's probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite aspect of jumping into a new fantasy book and seeing what different, clever, unique ways that the author has built up this secondary world for their characters to live in. And I think that when done correctly, world building can really set up your plot for success as a writer. So I kind of want to talk about the different ways that world building can weaken your story and how to improve that. I've also written a blog post on this exact topic, so if that's more your speed, you can check out the link to my article in the description below. So first we'll talk about what exactly world building entails. So world building goes beyond just the physical setting of a world, though it certainly includes that, things like geography and climate and the flora and fauna of the world. But it also goes beyond this to talk about the, people who live in the world with the different societies and cultures and government and politics and economics, religion and traditions, as well as the fun speculative stuff with technology and magic systems and the supernatural. World building also considers the history of the world, what happened prior that led to the events of your plot of your story. And while I'm going to be talking a lot specifically about fantasy, this certainly applies to any kind of secondary world building, and that can happen in all kinds of different speculative stories. So, extending this to sci fi as well. It just so happens that I've been working on a lot of high fantasy recently. The complexity of world building and building up a secondary world is often what draws speculative fiction writers in. That's often the fun part for speculative fiction writers, but because of how many aspects that you're having to play with, it can introduce a lot of incongruities and confusion for your readers, and it can be the reason that your readers put down your book. So let's dive in. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to spot these mistakes and then some tips and tricks for how to fix them. First one, the most common one, I see it all the time, the info dump, the information dump, and I get it. You have been working on this world as a writer. You've been working on this world for who knows how long, sometimes years. I can attest to that. And you want your readers to understand it as soon as possible, to really appreciate and grasp all of these really cool and neat aspects that you've come up with. Unfortunately, you do that by putting it all in like the first chapter. And it's not necessarily first chapter, but the first part of the book is often very heavily weighed down with exposition bits to explain your world and what's happening in the background. Often in third person point of view, the info dump is seen in like narration as an aside outside of what the main character or characters, whatever character you're focused on in the beginning, outside of what they're doing, but sometimes it appears in dialogue where your character is just going on and on explaining a particular topic. And you can often easily identify it because whatever topic is being explained is something that's happening, has happened off screen. So it does not directly going on in the scene as it stands. Perhaps your character is talking about some history of the forest they're walking through, or you're deciding that Now's a good time to explain when the character mentions that tomorrow is a special celebration, even though the scene has nothing to do with that celebration, that you're going to explain exactly what it is right there. So your reader can immediately understand what it is. Or maybe you're explaining the rules to your magic systems after you've first introduced a little teeny tiny hint of the magic. So if you're concerned that a bit in your writing possibly could be info dumping, another good way to check is if you edit it out of the scene, does the scene change? Does it affect the scene? Or does the scene just keep plodding along and it still makes sense? Now, does my scene make sense is different from does my audience understand all of the implications of this scene? Those are two different things. You want to make sure that narratively, logically, readers can get from point A to point B, but they don't need to understand all of that background information of why it matters just yet. Why does avoiding info dumping matter? Because readers want to feel connected to your story as soon as possible. And often the way that's done is through character. We want to get attached to your main character as soon as possible because that person is going to be driving us through the story. They're the one whose story matters. We want to understand what your main character's goals are, what their desires are, what's in the way of them accomplishing those desires, and we can learn about the world as your main character experiences it. Once your reader is invested in your main character, then the details of your world become important because they matter to that character. Delivering the information before connecting the meaning to what your character is experiencing is kind of like reading a history textbook. It's information that's not very exciting. It doesn't have any personal kind of meaning to the reader, if that makes sense. So, world building details should be earning their place on the page, and you can check this by asking yourself a few different questions. So, you can ask, does this detail raise tension? Does this detail reveal character? And does this detail deepen a scene that's already in progress? If it isn't doing any of these things, it doesn't belong quite there. Oftentimes, expository details can be better shown in a completely different scene. This could be through the actions or dialogues of another character, or it could be slowly revealed as the main character experiences something. If you're looking for some reading material that does this really well, shows how to avoid info dumping, how to incorporate your world building details naturally into your narrative, I highly, highly suggest The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. I love this series. The city that this world is set in has its own criminal hierarchy and social codes and history and cultural customs. It's set in this like otherworld Venice, and one of the opening scenes is shark fighting. Super fun. But Lynch never stops the story to explain anything. You take in the world naturally through what the characters are experiencing, what they're talking about. Everything is very matter of fact. And through contextual clues, you start piecing together how this world works. So I highly recommend The Lies of Locke Lamora. Super fun. So the next point is what I'm calling terminology overload, which is the cousin of the info dump. But what happens is, instead of things getting explained, things are just dropped in with no explanation. And there's not enough contextual clues for the readers to hint at what's going on. Oftentimes this happens in secondary worlds because there's foreign or invented languages incorporated into the world, so you'll have an invented term or a proper noun that doesn't get explained, or a reference to a historical event that also doesn't get explained. And while each instance of these references are small on their own, they're not taking up a lot of space, they're a 1 or 2 word appearance in a sentence. After you've gone through a dozen or so pages of this, you can feel really overwhelmed as a reader. As a writer, every unfamiliar term that you introduce, you are asking your readers to put a pin in it and hold on to it. And you're promising them that it's going to matter, that it's going to be important, that it will pay off later. And it's especially difficult for readers to do this with invented languages because oftentimes they start feeling similar. Maybe the spellings are the same, maybe the same phonetic constructions are similar. So they then have a hard time differentiating between different terms. Readers are willing to learn and hold on to new terminology, but they're only willing to do that so many times. When too much goes unexplained or unused, readers start to question what's actually important here. And then their eyes start to just glaze over terms that you really want them to hold on to, but they're not going to be able to. When too many terms go unexplained or unused, readers stop trusting that the effort to remember them will be rewarded in the end. And that's when you lose them. So the key here is to be really ruthless with what terminology you're introducing to your readers. Oftentimes, your world probably needs the things those terms describe, but not the actual made-up word for it. And the key here is to choose a handful of the most important ones and just stick to those. And then give your readers a reason why you've chosen to use a different word for this thing that you could describe with just a regular word. As an example, say in this world, you really want to use your made-up language for the word moon. Instead of saying the word moon, you want to use up this made-up language. As a reader, I want to know why you've chosen the word moon to be different in this world. What is the payoff here? And this is how you build deep world building. Maybe the culture of your main character, who uses this term for moon, worships the moon as some kind of deity. Or maybe the governmental structure of the society revolves around the moon's phases. So this is a very practical term that's used in every day that's tied back to something very concrete. This will move your terminology use beyond just a simple translation and into a deeper world building. And then when you do introduce terminology, let the meaning build around what your characters are doing and saying instead of defining the term outright. Trust your readers are smart and that they'll use context clues to figure out what terms mean. Just don't overwhelm them with too many. This also extends to character names. So I've worked on quite a few fantasy manuscripts where they have a large cast of main characters, kind of like a D&D campaign, where a bunch of them have equal screen time, so to say, in your book. At the start of your story, choose your main character or one of the mains in this group and stick to them for a little bit before introducing slowly the rest of the cast. You want to make sure that your readers completely understand and visualize each character on their own before opening up into a scene where they're all interacting with each other and the readers never met them before. It's hard as writers because we've lived in these worlds and with these characters for so long, you can lose a sense of how difficult it is for readers to grasp new information when it's being lodged at you in quick succession with a ton of different new words and terminology and different aspects of your society or culture that is completely different from anything that we recognize in the here and now in the real world. I think a lot of authors do this really well. A particular example that came to mind is in The Final Empire, which is the first of the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson. He introduces the word ska without ever explaining what it means, and he does this through details. We learn that ska sleep in barracks. We learn that ska don't look at the nobles in the eye. So you get a sense of the class system in the story without it ever being explained that this is a class system and we're talking about a lower class here. So I'm calling this next point derivative world building, and it might sound like a hot take, but bear with me, I'm not bashing on anyone's favorite tropes here. If a world feels too familiar, too predictable, too guessable, we've seen this before, it can cause readers to put down your book. For speculative fiction and fantasy and sci-fi, there are some very common tropes that have been used over and over and over again that we all recognize. I don't have to name any titles for particular stories to pop up in your brain. When I talk about medieval Europe with elves and goblins and orcs, or magic academies where teenagers build and learn about their powers, or teen battle royale, or dystopian societies where people are divided up into houses or factions or districts. All of these are super familiar frameworks, and they are familiar for a reason. They've produced some really iconic, incredible stories. The problem is that so many books get overshadowed because they stick too closely to these tropes. Their world building is not different enough. When a setting is built from pieces that readers already recognize, the world stops creating any sense of discovery. It confirms what's expected instead of revealing something new. These worlds feel too familiar, the readers guess what's going to happen, and it becomes boring. Now, this isn't about avoiding familiar structures altogether. Tropes and archetypes are super useful for developing stories, and as writers, we often have our favorites that we want to use. We just need to use them in new and innovative ways. And you can think about it this way. Is the trope or archetype that you're applying the destination of your story, the purpose of your story, what you want readers to experience and feel that atmosphere? Or is it the starting point? Is it the foundation that you're building on, your jumping off point to do something different? And again, this is not to bash if you do want it to be the destination, because some people do really like reading within particular tropes, and they'll just keep reading stories over and over within those tropes. However, this predictability can become really boring for most readers. And if you want to set your story apart from others, asking yourself, what happens in this world that can only happen in this world, is kind of your key question here. Take a look at the smaller details of the world, the things that affect your main character directly, and play with it until it feels different. I really like brainstorming with my friends on these kinds of issues, so definitely talk to other people, get their advice, get their feedback, get their insight. Oftentimes, I don't necessarily absorb and take all of those ideas from other people, but what happens is it's a jumping off point for me to think about things differently. The example I want to talk about that does this really well is Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Absolutely love this book. I love post-apocalyptic fiction, and this is a story that has a very familiar post-apocalyptic framework. We're in a world where it's survival of the fittest. Your main character is going on a physical journey, walking across a particular, usually desolate landscape, and has to survive against all odds. We've seen this before. However, these tropes are transformed and reimagined in real-world systems. Class and race and religion and politics. We see all of that very, very grounded in this world, and they're all very specific to the main character. On top of that, the protagonist possesses a very unique trait, a kind of magic, if you will, called hyper-empathy, that is oftentimes a curse rather than a blessing, oftentimes a crippling feeling of suffering with others, which is so dangerous in a post-apocalyptic world where everybody is out for themselves. And it's because of this that this story feels very innovative among other post-apocalyptic survival stories. Great, so the next point I want to talk about is unused world building. Oftentimes as writers, we've thought a lot about the world. We fleshed out a lot of the world building before we even put down pen to paper. And maybe you know the history of your world, and you know all the different political structures, and you know how the economy works, and you know how your magic system interacts with different materials and such, you could write a textbook on your world. Sometimes that information doesn't crop up in your scenes in any kind of meaningful way. It's sitting in your notes document, but it's not on the page to affect your characters. Sometimes it's being referenced, sometimes it's not even getting mentioned. Sometimes you've hyperfixated on particular aspects of your world building and ignored other aspects. Maybe you've got your magic systems and you've got your governments and you've got your geography, but maybe there aren't any cultural customs in your story that reveals the values and fears of your main character. Or maybe the inventions in your world are just assumed, and the kind of technology that your characters are using is just what happens in our world, give or take a couple hundred years. Maybe your character's a noble lady, but you've never actually mentioned that she uses a chamber pot. So you want to make sure all that work you're doing with your world building is showing up on the page. World building that's not on the page is world building for you, but not for the reader. And understanding your world can really positively impact your plot in that your story is consistent because you understand the world, but you also need to be making sure that those details are coming up so that your reader also fully understands the world. You want to be thinking about how that political system that you've built out is cropping up in the story. Is it coming up in dialogue between characters? Can you feel it in how different characters treat each other, maybe? Is your magic system creating problems for your characters to solve? Is the economic logic of your world causing issues for what your characters can and cannot do? So making sure your world building is truly integrated into your story and appearing on the page is the key thing here. And if there's things you've left out, ask yourself, where would this make sense for it to surface? Where does it matter? You don't want to be falling into the trap of info dumping just to make sure that you've included details in your world. You want those details to be meaningful. A great example of this is Susanna Clarke's Piranesi. Beautiful book, absolutely stunning. I loved every minute of it. It's set in this place called the House, which is this labyrinth of rooms and statues and tides that come in. It is strange and very detailed, but all of those details are doing narrative work. The layout of the halls is how the main character Piranesi moves through the story. The presence of tides and how they come in and wash through and threaten to overwhelm him creates real tension in the story. The statues are odd yet slightly familiar, and they carry a kind of meaning that gets revealed slowly as the story goes on. And while the atmosphere is absolutely captivating, it's not just atmosphere for atmosphere's sake. It's all connected to something that matters, which kind of is a good segue into the last point, very, very similar to point number 4, toothless world building. And this is specifically an issue with main characters, is that oftentimes the world building is present and it affects everyone around the main character or the main cast of characters, but it doesn't meaningfully affect your main character. And oftentimes this comes up in fantasies or other speculative stories, and that your main character is overpowered. There's no consequences for your main character. The other people, plenty of consequences, but not for your main character. Sometimes this can be seen on journey stories where the hero is moving just along the pace and trajectory that they wanted to, that they intended to, with no friction. Nothing's pushing back on them. Maybe resources are scarce, but they always seem to manage. Or maybe there's an oppressive regime, and where most people would not be able to pass, somehow your protagonist passes with ease. Maybe your main character discovers that they actually have magical abilities, but oh wait, they're also super gifted and don't need to train, and they also beat other magic users who have had years of experience compared to them. So the world can bite, it just doesn't bite where it counts. Not at your main character, and not in a way that forces them into a corner. And I think here's what's difficult about this is because it's not like the world building isn't present. It's there on the page, it's in the background, other people experience it, even your main character experiences it, but there's no pressure on your main character because of it. So the world building should be serving your main characters in a way. Not in a way that your main character can just easily breeze through everything, but in a way that it's impactful. The world building forces your character to make decisions that are tough. Maybe the geography is dangerous and they're en route, but then they gotta take a detour, or then they're held back, or then they come across something that they weren't quite expecting, and now they gotta rethink their plan. Or maybe the economics of the world are really forcing their hand. It's forcing what they're able to do, what they can afford to do, what they're desperate enough to risk, and what's simply out of their reach. If you swap out the details of your world building, but your protagonist is still able to do the same things, then it's not making enough of an impact. So find those pressure points in your world building and make the world mean something for the character that this story is about. And for my last example of this video, for this one particular, the first book of the Earthsea series, A Wizard of Earthsea, is an incredible example of world building that bites. The archipelago where Ged lives shapes him directly and very personally. The social hierarchy of Roke really deeply affects him, and it forces him to make some pretty poor choices, and that sets him off on the entire character arc for his journey. And this choice has repercussions that are built into the world itself. This is a story of pride and humility, and the consequences of his actions literally follow him, because that is how this world is built. Amazing story, Wizard of Earthsea. Highly recommend. Oh, Ursula K. Le Guin, of course. I don't remember if I mentioned that. But yeah, world building in general, probably one of the most rewarding parts of writing speculative fiction and reading speculative fiction. But it also can be one of the easiest places where you lose that connecting thread between the story that you're telling and the world that it's set in. But all of these world building weaknesses can be summed up by the question, is my world building serving my characters and my story, or is it serving itself? When your world details are earning their place on the page, when they're affecting your characters, when they're generating real stakes, real consequences, and pushing back against the people moving through it, your readers will feel it. And that's when your world building stops being just a backdrop in your story and what makes your story impossible for readers to put down. Let me know down in the comments your favorite aspects of world building, or maybe some fun detail of the world that you're building right now. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I post about writing and my personal goals. And if you're a genre fiction writer looking for an editor, you can check out the link to my website in the description below that has some details on my editing services. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, bye!